And this is the one that everyone has a hard time with because there is no sh sound in Azure language, so it's Sahida. There's no sh. It's
Oh.
yeah, there's no ch sh th. It's you pronounce the H.
Oh. Sahida. Interesting. Okay. Because I was definitely pronouncing it like Shieda.
Yeah, that one throws everybody. I don't know why I did that to myself, but I guess to make it just a very distinctive language from English, there is no H blend in Azure language. You pronounce every letter that's written in someone's name. Like, eventually I am going to release a whole guide to, like, how to pronounce Azure language and, like, a minor dictionary of Azure words so you can actually go through and translate people's names.
Oh, jeez, I would love
Though
that.
it's not always easy, especially with Morit Gera, because the way they combine their names, they can mean... It's almost like kanji. Like, you can hear the name, but you need to, like, know what the intention is to get the right meaning out of it. With some of them.
Oh.
Like, Quilton Gera is very cut and dry, and specific suffixes mean specific things. Morit Gera is a little bit more lyrical with their naming system, so it's not as easy to... Like, that's why Androa Murray has to specifically say that her name means the scent of heather, because if you didn't know that, Androa is, like, a prefix that precedes most flowers. So if you didn't know that it was specifically combining the word for heather and smell, it might just be, you might interpret it as the smell of flowers or the smell of a different flower. It's...
Ah, but it takes on more specific meaning depending on, like, what your intention was.
Yeah, it's... I mean, Azure in general is a language that you have to know the speaker because a lot of it is inferred meaning, and you'd have to know the speaker and their intention to get a lot of the... It makes it very difficult to translate into Eastern or Common Language because you need to know what the person is talking about half the time.
Yeah, and they, Azure's mostly practice, like, oral history, too, don't they? So that's probably, like, a big part of the culture as well, is, like, explaining the meaning and intent behind something so it's remembered.
Yeah, they don't have a written system in their native culture.
That's cool. So then I have to ask, what made you want to create a writing system like this?
Honestly, I looked at the appendices of Lord of the Rings and thought, I'm crazy enough to do that. Since then, I have found out that there are people who actually critique conlings on YouTube, and that terrifies me because I am not a linguist. I don't know if Azure is an actual functional language or if it would just fall short. I hope that those people never find me.
It's super in-depth either way. Like, I've known several people, you know, throughout my life who have tried to create a language, but, like, it usually doesn't go super deep. Whereas, like, the Azure language is really deep, even if you aren't necessarily a linguist yourself.
Oh yeah, they have a whole grammatical structure, and past, present, future tense is actually determined by specific suffixes that are added to a word. I did a lot of work. I tried really hard, so if it's not an actual usable language, then at least I can say it's one that you can pick up a few phrases in, at least.
That's super cool. Either way, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for anyone who might not know who you are?
Absolutely. So, some of you listening may know me from some other videos on Tennille's channel that we've done in the past, but if this is your first time hearing my voice on this channel, my name is Avalon Roselin. I am an author, and I am actually the person who writes the Clouded Moon novelization as well as my own books.
Hell yeah! Tell them about the books you've written.
So I have published 4 books independently, with more on the way. My first book was a horror novel called Alice that Tennille has never and will never read.
I do not do horror.
Perfectly
so
fine.
Sorry.
Totally understandable. If if it's not for you, it's not for you, and that's okay. It's good to know your own limits.
Yes, and I encourage anyone who is into horror to go out and enjoy the thing, but it will not be me.
And I do have full content warnings. I've recently moved my bookstore to Etsy, and all of my listings contain full content warnings so that you know what you're getting into before you click the purchase button. But Alice is definitely, being a horror book, my darkest work. And the book after that was Like Falling Stars, which did a total 180. It's a very cute slice of life, fantasy fairy tale kind of story that's all about friendship between this amnesiac woman and a fairy prince that she meets. And still has content warnings just in case, because sometimes fairy tales can get dark, but the book itself, I would say, is sweet dreams fuel as opposed to nightmare fuel.
It sounds very sweet.
It's super cute. This term didn't exist when the book was published, but very cottagecore-y.
And cottagecore is huge now.
Oh, yeah.
You were ahead of your time.
I was super ahead of my time because when I started working on this book, Frozen came out. So,
oh,
and then
damn,
I was like,
okay.
Oh, god damn it.
And then the two books that we're here mostly to talk about is your Stellar Eclipse series.
Yes, so I've had a hard time figuring out exactly how to describe the Stellar Eclipse series in the, 140 character limit that most people want you to describe things in nowadays. All of my works tend to be a little bit genre fluid.
That's the joy of being an independent author. You get to fuck with the genres as much as you want.
Oh, no boxes for me.
Yeah.
Also, thank you for informing me we can say fuck. Good.
You're welcome.
It's a dark urban fantasy thriller series, but with heavy focus on family drama elements, especially as the books move forward. The first book is definitely the most thriller, and then as it goes on, a lot of it is just dealing with the emotional fallout of the events of the first book, and the way that the family that found each other and forged those bonds in the first book continue their lives through various hardships and just things that they're dealing with in this fantasy world. Because there's a lot, because I spent way too long developing this fantasy world.
What made you decide to make it a series? Because your first two books were standalone. What particularly made you want to make this a series?
The first two books being standalone, unfortunately now has to be in the past tense because they're getting sequels too.
Oh, hell yeah.
I am Boo Boo the Fool, and I couldn't stop. With Stellar Eclipse, it was actually conceived as a series, and it was just, I knew that there were more stories that I wanted to tell in this world and with these characters than were going to fit in a single book. And a lot of them are very different from each other. Like I said, the first book is the most thriller. It actually deals with two of the main characters coming out of their retirement as detectives to track down a serial killer. And then in the second book, it deals more with the world at large and exploring the world that was created. It introduces completely different sets of characters, completely different kinds of conflicts. So they most definitely weren't going to work as a single book. It also would have been just way too long as a single book.
I was shocked at how different book 2 felt, and in a good way, because the whole focus of the book, like you were mentioning, completely shifts. So much of the first book is set on establishing our main characters and the kind of conflicts that they've had to deal with in the past. But the second book really dives into the world building, which I love because I love world building. But it's fun how, because you're a self-published author, like, you don't have to worry about not hitting the same checkboxes as the first book. You can just be like, okay, we did that part, now we can focus on something else in the next book.
And now for something completely different.
Yeah.
And that's gonna continue on into book 3, which I won't get into with details, obviously, but Book 3 is definitely going to be a lot more introspective for one of the character point of views. Most of the conflict is internal, and we will be continuing that world building. We're going to actually get to see the eastern side of the continent, so for those not familiar with the series, most of the story takes place in the west, which is on the western half of this continent. There's a mountain range that goes down the middle, and most of the plot and story happens in the west. That's where most of the characters are from. In Book 3, we'll get to see the eastern side of things, and that'll continue that world building to see this just completely different biome that exists on that side of the continent, completely different culture, language, people, and the conflict that there has been between the east and the west sides due to colonialism, which is the villain of every book.
Hooray!
Yay, colonialism.
So I did want to say that, you have trouble doing the quote-unquote, like, sales pitch on the back of the book. So I wrote my own little, like, hey, if you like found family dynamics and plots that center around marginalized folks kicking ass and dealing with their traumas, you should check out Stellar Eclipse. That's my sales pitch.
I mean, yeah, it is nothing but marginalized people kicking ass and dealing with trauma, so absolutely.
So for a more generalized question, what inspired you to start writing?
That's a good one.
I know, this is always a difficult question, because, like, whenever I get hit with the, what inspired you to start drawing? And it's like, well, I don't know, I liked doing it. And then I just kept doing it.
Yeah, it's just been so much a part of me for so long that I frankly can't imagine there was ever a time when I didn't. And in fact, I don't think there was ever a time that I didn't write. Some of my earliest memories when I was just but a wee lass were picking up a pencil and trying to write words before I even could read. I was trying to write, putting together some notebook paper in a folder and drawing a cover on it and pretending that it was a book.
Oh, hell yeah.
Writing stories about animals and my friends and dragons. Always dragons. So many dragon stories.
Did your school ever... Our school used to do this, so I'm wondering, did your schools ever have those, like, little white blank books that you would make into books for, like, a class assignment or anything like that?
My brother's class did that one year, but I never had a class that did that project.
Oh, that's too bad.
And I was always so jealous that he got to have his, like, because it looks like a real book that you'd buy in a store almost. Just, with a 8-year-old's handwriting inside. And I was always so jealous that he had one of those and I didn't. So it's just been something that has been a part of what I do forever. And in middle school is when I really started taking it seriously as something that I could do to make money off of. Someday I think that was roughly around the time that Aragon was published, and I found out that Christopher Paolini was very young when he published Aragon. So I set my sights on being the next, brilliant teen author. Obviously that didn't quite pan out, but it gave me practice.
I forgot that he was really young. That's right.
I want to say that he wrote Aragon when he was like 16, and by the time he was 19 is when it was published.
Damn.
So, we can say what we want about Aragon, but...
Yeah, that's a whole other topic. I never read the books, but I've heard.
Hey, he got his name out there, so...
He sure did.
Kudos
Good for him.
So I started writing more seriously through middle school and high school. Published some very unfinished drafts in college, in my early college days. Took those down, and then really seriously learned about editing. Like, I took some crash courses in editing and cleaning things up. Republished in 2016 Alice, but still didn't have the funds to get it professionally edited, which is why this year we actually did a 5th year anniversary re-release where I could actually, through the wonderful funding of my patrons, get it professionally edited, cleaned up a little bit more, and then put back as its best self. And I'm sure that Like Falling Stars is probably going to get the same treatment The Stellar Eclipse series was really the first set of books that got that full editorial service.
People don't realize how much back-end work goes into creating a book. How many edits do you think Cloudless Rain went through alone?
That depends. Are we talking when I started writing it in middle school or
Okay, so if you had to put it on a timeline, how many edits did it go through when you first conceived it? And then how many edits did it go through when you actually were serious about it, sat down, wrote out the first draft, and then how many drafts were there until the finished product?
Oh boy, all right, let me think about this, 'cause so many things changed from the early draft and what it was initially conceived as. Not the plot necessarily, like the main base plot stayed the same, but the way the characters interacted and who they were as people changed so much.
Interesting.
So, all the way back to when I was but a wee 13 years old, that was 12 years. 12 years that this book spent in, from its initial conception to actually building all the world, building the language, revising everything, and then actually putting out something that I feel is a product that I would actually be comfortable charging people money to read.
Well, hell yeah. I mean, I gotta say, Stellar Eclipse as a series so far, both of the books, feel very polished.
Oh, thank you. From the very, very start to the very, very finished product of Cloudless Rain, I would say no less than probably 45 drafts or so. Just, spread out over the course of 12 years ain't that bad. I know that I finished both the initial version of Cloudless Rain, which was at the time called Azure Rain, and Dark Lightning, which was at the time called Crimson Lightning. They had like a color weather name.
Oh.
And then I changed that later on because I didn't feel like it fit. I liked the more meteorological names better as we moved on from that. So, and the titles now have a little bit more paradox in them, Cloudless Rain, Dark Lightning.
Yeah.
It feels a little bit more compelling, I think. Crimson Lightning actually referenced a plot point that got cut, but we can talk about that later.
I was wondering about that. I was like, Crimson Lightning, what could that refer to?
The first time I actually finished both of them completely, I think I actually finished book 2 first because I was writing them at the same time, like the mad woman I was as a teenager. And I was on a camping trip with my family, and I finished the second book, and because I often refer to the second book's plot as the family camping trip from hell. It's just awkward family camping, the book, with, a lot more action and intrigue thrown in, but there's definitely those elements of being on a camping trip with your extended family that you don't know that well in there.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, and it's not just like the family camping trip, it's the extended family camping trip, which makes it even more awkward.
Yeah, and it's definitely some elements of my camping experiences worked their way into pre-version Crimson Lightning, and I think there's still some of them there in Dark Lightning. Just, if you've ever been on that camping trip with, like, distant cousins that you don't know that well, I feel like there's some relatable content still there.
Oh, absolutely. There's a scene in book 2 specifically where Azzy is talking to his cousin, and, like, it's such a small personal moment, but it stuck with me so much because it reminded me of so many different times that I'd been on camping trips myself.
Yeah, it's... Despite the fact that it's in this fantasy world with these different kinds of people and fantasy cultures and all that, I think it's still a very human book and a very human situations that these characters get into, despite the, fantasy elements that are also at play. I think it's just relatable to anyone. But yeah, I would say total number of drafts from start to finish was probably somewhere like at least 45, if not more. And then from the time I was really, really serious to releasing Cloudless Rain was probably closer to something like 8 drafts, including all the edits that it went through, because it went through a few rounds of editing with the content editor, line editor, and then going through again looking for typos. And there's actually a funny story with Dark Lightning and typos.
Yeah.
So when you self-publish a book and you want to stock your own store with them, you need to purchase from the printer that distributes your work. And my printer is Ingram Spark. They also distribute to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, basically any major bookseller. A lot of them get their books from Ingram Spark. That's the kind of industry standard printer that is used. So I was so confident that there was nothing more that was needed from Dark Lightning, that we had done all of our work, and
I know this story, so yes. I'm already laughing.
I was absolutely confident that we did not need to do any more editing because it had been through so many rounds of editing and so many people had looked at it. I was ready to go. So I just placed the bulk order because I was confident that it, they usually advise that you order one copy and read it over before you order any more in case there's formatting errors or anything like that. But I was very confident and getting very close to the publication date and wanted to have orders ready for pre-ordering from what was at the time my website store. So I just ordered a whole crate, and then I opened it up and there was a typo in the second sentence of the book that wasn't all it was that there was a had that had been removed that should not have been. It needed to stay there. And without that one little had, the whole sentence was just a clusterfuck. And it
was the second sentence of the whole book.
Yeah, and I had 20 odd books with this unbearable typo. So I just had to fix that, reorder the whole crate, and then basically send out the mistyped copies as free ARC review copies, with the caveat that yes, I'm aware that this typo is here, please ignore it. Here's a free review copy. Please post your reviews on Amazon or Goodreads or wherever you can post them. I was so embarrassed. Don't just buy in bulk, kids. Always check your copy first.
Always, always, always do a test print. Yeah. So it was interesting that you said that you wrote the second book, or you finished the second book first. So that kind of leads me into wanting to ask about Cloudless Rain, the first book, which has more of the thriller mystery element in it. Were mystery books and thriller books an inspiration for you going into this series, or did you know that the story needed to have this, and so you were kind of working outside of your element? How'd you deal with that?
So funnily enough, this goes back to the family camping trip thing, because mystery novels were not the inspiration for Cloudless Rain. It was actually these mystery cassette tapes that my grandma would bring with her on our annual camping trip to the beach. So there's this beach that we would go to every year camping for my grandma's birthday, and they had a, what are they called? Tent trailer.
Oh, yeah.
They had a tent trailer. So my mom and my dad would sleep in their tent, and me and my brother would sleep in the tent trailer with my grandparents. And every night before we went to sleep, they would put on these mystery cassette tapes. And they were just these recorded radio dramas of these different mystery plots. And they would serve us hot cocoa, and we would listen, and we were just kind of that was the end of our day anytime we went camping with Grandma and Grandpa to this beach.
Gosh, that is peak summer memories.
And some part of me just internalized that memory so hard that I wanted to write a story that felt like one of those mystery stories out of, those radio drama mysteries. And there is actually a radio drama mystery series in the book that is inspired by those tapes.
Oh, that's awesome.
My mom actually found the tapes a few years ago because we lost them for the longest time, and we actually found them and listened to one of them not that long ago And the quality is so bad because they're so old, they're so scratchy, but just the memories came flooding back from listening to this mystery cassette tape when I was a little kid. So that was actually the inspiration for Cloudless Rain. And then the initial draft of Dark Lightning, the one that was finished first, did have a lot more mystery elements to it, because I just felt like this is a mystery series, so every book has to have this mystery in it. And that was one of the things that got cut out of the current version because it just didn't fit. It was very clunky, and I realized that what I wanted to focus on more as the series progresses is just the characters and their relationships versus just trying to force a mystery plot element into every single book. So that's part of why Cloudless Rain and Dark Lightning feel so different, I think, is because the mystery element was always a core part of Cloudless Rain's story. It's one that I really enjoyed, versus Dark Lightning, where it was just there for the sake of it.
It was there to check a box.
Yeah, and because of that, I ended up removing it in later drafts because it didn't fit.
Well, that validates me because I actually wrote down specifically that I find that a lot of both of your books revolve around the growth of the characters as kind of the driving force behind the books. So I wanted to ask, do you, when you're writing, usually focus on characterization first and how to get a character, you know, to where they need to be by the end of the book? Or is it usually more plot focused and the characterization happens within that?
When I was a younger writer, I was definitely all about the plot. I thought that I needed to have the most interesting and cool story idea, and that was what was going to make a good book. And as I grew up and actually took some writing classes and examined what I actually like to read about in literature, I definitely became a character-focused writer. An interesting character can get a reader through any kind of story. And sometimes a reader just needs a story where technically nothing happens, you know, in air quotes, but we're just on the journey with the character and seeing their experience and their growth. And I think that as the series goes on, there is a little bit of a shift away from a big plot to just big character moments and character relationships. Cloudless Rain, I would say, is probably the most plot heavy, and I love it for that. I think that the plot in Cloudless Rain serves to be a good introduction to these characters and the kind of world that they live in. And then as the series goes on, it's more just about following those characters and how they're navigating that world.
For sure. And how did you start the world building for Stellar Eclipse? Because it's deceptively simple in Cloudless Rain. There's a lot that if you're not paying attention, you won't pick up on. But it's obviously still very, very deep. So how did the characters affect the world building, and how did the world building affect the characters?
I'm just going to put out there first and foremost that if you're writing a series like this, the absolute best resource you can have is a series Bible.
Absolutely.
You need a place to put all your world building notes and keep track of everything, because I created this big world with the knowledge that not everything was going to fit into the books. So I have this huge notebook full of information that will probably never end up in the books, but that I can refer back to see, okay, what might be happening around this time when the story is happening, what might be going on that the characters might see, or that other minor characters, you know, in the crowds, what might the main characters overhear them talking about. And it just makes the setting feel much more fleshed out and lived in, and like the characters are part of a bigger world. They're not just floating in space.
Yeah.
And then just tried to decide, okay, where do I want to be? What can I explore in this area? And what are the characters going to find in that area if they go looking?
You start big and then you narrow down into the details.
Yeah. And because I knew I wanted multiple different Azure tribes, because Azures are not a monolith. They are different in culture. They are different in their general builds, the kinds of lives that they lead, some of their spiritual beliefs. They're similar, but they each have their own take on it. So I didn't want to just have like one, group A and group B. I wanted to have a lot of different groups. And then even with the Easterners, we're going to find that they have more groups than just Easterner. There's a lot of subgroups in that culture as well. Because when I look around the world that I live in, there isn't just group A and group B.
Exactly. Right. So speaking of that, and talking about the Azures, can you tell us about, like, how each of their cultures makes them a little different from each other, like, in terms of features and language?
Yes, so this is going to be fun because of the way that this developed out.
Yeah.
Because I am working on a culture guide book, which is basically how to build your D&D homebrew Azure character 101.
I love that.
But the actual book is basically going to be a defictionalized version of a textbook that exists in universe that was written from an Eastern perspective.
Oh, I love that.
So it's racist. There's like a lot of unintentional but definitive racism in how that book presents these groups, and I'm trying to find a way where I can have that but also have like little notes from one of the Azure characters correcting things throughout, like, crossing things out and being like, no, this isn't why we do this, and I don't want to spoil which character it is because that spoils what they end up doing with their life later.
I will absolutely eat that up. I love in-world stuff like that because you're dealing with a narrator that you can't trust, but it's supposed to be something that's very educational and direct and, like, factual. But, oh, that's tasty. Yes, anyway, please, continue.
And I love the character who is the author of that book and we'll get to see him in book 3, and I'm so excited to write him because we're just gonna love to shake our heads at him, I think, because in his mind, he is like Azure ally number 1. Like, he thinks that he's doing a great job bringing representation to Eastern academia about Azures, but he is the only voice that there is, and it's not coming from the Azure people.
Right.
It's just coming from him talking about his assumptions and, the information that he's gathered from a scant few interviews that he has managed to have with Azures that are no longer living in their native tribe, that he's met in cities, about what they think, bits and pieces that have been passed down through generations of disconnect between their original culture and their current trying to survive in the city. One group straight up lies to him about everything because they don't want to share their culture outside of their people. So they just make up bullshit to tell him, and he just publishes it like it's real. Oh,
man. So yeah, you're tackling some real light subjects in these books, obviously.
Yeah, it's a lot, and I love it.
It's fantastic.
I kind of developed backwards from that, where I just, I had this character in my mind, like, telling me all this stuff, and then also in my mind were, like, these other characters being like, no. How they developed in my mind started off as these broad, kind of generalized ideas of what these tribes would be good at, and then got more and more detailed with how would they actually lead their day-to-day lives, how do they interact with each other when they're not dealing with the stress and the conflict of these people coming over from the other side of the continent and taking over their land and trying to change them into what the Eastern culture would want them to be. And it's a very different kind of lifestyle when you take that out of the equation. So I, as the person making it, got to see both the real, full character of what these fictional cultures are like and how different they are from what they're perceived to be. So the first tribe that we're introduced to is Quiltangera. This is the one that Eoreka comes from, and they play a big part in the first book. And their reputation is that they are a warrior tribe. They are trained to fight and hunt. They are considered the most dominant predator, basically, because they have massive endurance, very sharp claws, really strong bite strength. If you made a tiger a person, like, they are just big, strong, fast. They have expanded lung capability because they mainly fish and are able to hunt in water as well as on land. So they have very large chest, lung capacity to be able to hold their breath for a long time, and that also means that they are really good with, like, endurance running. They can run for a really long time. They're not the fastest, but they can go a really long time because they have that expanded lung capability.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's their reputation, is that they're this fearsome, warmongering, oh, you better watch out, they're gonna kill you if you look at them the wrong way. And then their actual culture, their personality as a group, because, you know, everyone is different. There is no person who is a perfect representation of their culture.
Right.
What mostly characterizes their identity as a group to themselves is a love of family, a love of community. They're very playful with each other. They, you know, they like to show off a little bit, but when they're swimming and stuff, like, they love to just play in the river. They play with their kids a lot. They have music and dance where they regale, like, these ancient battles that, you know, are probably mythological, that didn't really happen. But as far as their own opinion of how warlike they are, they would probably think first of, like, these ballads that they sing to entertain each other, more than they would think of, like, actually fighting. They're big and intimidating, but they're not cruel. They're not mean.
Yeah, and it speaks a lot that one of our main characters from Quilton Guerra is Eureka, who is no longer a part of that community anymore.
Yeah, and I believe that there's a line in Cloudless Rain, actually, where one of the other characters, because he doesn't have a perspective until Dark Lightning, but he's talking about, or he mentions something about how he was actually exiled from his tribe, and he doesn't really like to talk about it, obviously, because losing that community is basically a death sentence in their eyes. Like, it may as well have been killing him, because to be without your community is a fate worse than death to them. One of the other characters who is not a part of that culture has this thought of, like, what if he wasn't mean enough, and, like, they got rid of him because he was too nice? And that just isn't a thought that anyone from Quilton Guerra would have had. It's just based on what they look like and that reputation, where it's completely ridiculous to even think that that would be the case.
To someone from the outside, it's like, oh, Eureka escaped. He was able to make it out. When really, like, it was a very devastating experience that he went through.
Yeah, and there are a lot of very nice people in Quilton Guerra that we get to see throughout the story. Like, it's not even like, oh, he's the odd one out. A lot of them are very fun and playful. Even the serious ones, like Keita, his brother. There's a scene where we get to see Keita just playing with some of the younger Azures. And even though he's seen as a very serious and kind of hardline character, he still plays. Because that's more of the cultural identity that is actually present in this tribe, is that playfulness and that connection to each other through play and through story and music. It's not all serious. There's more than that, but that's what people see because they're intimidated by their size. The other prominent one that we see in Cloudless Rain is Yggdrasil Guerra, and they are affectionately amongst us called the Hidden Elf Village, because that's kind of the fantasy role that they play. Like, if this was a Tolkien-esque fantasy world, they would be the elves.
I feel called out to personally right here, because I'm like, I think they're so interesting.
Yeah. And so the view that people have of them, because they live in this valley that's surrounded by these tall hills, it's always got this mist in it because of the waterfalls that flow through it, like, kind of obscures everything. So they live in this very kind of foggy valley that there's just fog all the time. So the ideas that people have of them is that they're very mysterious and elegant and, like you'd think of elves.
Yeah, yeah.
And more or less they're farmers. Like, they're
just out in the boondocks.
Yeah, their culture is they don't eat meat. They are one of the groups that each group kind of has an animal that is significant to their mythology, and theirs is the only prey animal. So they don't eat meat. So in order to make sure they got enough food, they farm. And they farm very specific kinds of plants that grow in the environment they live in. There is a lot of silk. They have some kind of trees, like, there's a certain kind of tree that grows there that the bark is very silky. If you peel the bark and then kind of comb it, it becomes these silk threads. So they collect that and embroider it into very beautiful robes and things. And that's just decorative because it's something to do that they enjoy. But primarily, they're farmers. And that's not really something that you would think of with, like, this, elegant, beautiful, graceful farmer. So it's a very different kind of lifestyle that they actually have, as opposed to this romanticized ideal that outsiders have. And we don't get to see a lot of them because, unfortunately, things happen. I won't spoil. What we do get to see of them, we don't get to see as much of that, but they will feature in a future book, and we will get to actually see more of just the day-to-day, without the stress and tension of what's going on in Cloudless Rain. Another thing to point out is that when we see these groups in these books, we're seeing them under stress, under strain, and duress.
Oh, for sure.
And it's not necessarily how they would normally act. This is not a normal day in the life of these tribes.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we get to Morit Gera, and it actually is a normal one for them.
Oh, Morit Gera.
They're struggling. They're struggling real hard.
It was a time.
And this is why I say that the real villain of all of these books is colonialism and the institutional racism that comes with it, because when you actually trace the source of any of the conflicts in these books back to the earliest point of starting, it's usually because of something that happened due to the colonizing of the West. Dark Lightning hits that in a big way, because there's a lot of land dispute going on that wouldn't be happening if the Easterners didn't keep taking land.
Yeah, actually, this was one of my questions, is that a lot of the conflict in both books centers around the fact that the Azures have just been screwed over by higher powers. They're losing a lot of their culture and their homes, and having to deal with that. We'll come back to the Azures in a bit, but how or when did you just decide to tackle this as, like, the main subject of your book?
This is going to be a tricky question to answer because there is definitely a lot to be said about me as a white author approaching subjects that are generally seen as things that would be better handled by people of color and authors of color. And I definitely think that we should be promoting works by authors of color who have more directly been impacted by the effects of colonialism.
For sure.
Putting that out there. Like I said, I started this when I was 13. I didn't really have that awareness. I don't even think I had that awareness when I published Cloudless Rain. And by now, I think that all I can really do is just bring more attention to the fact that this is an ongoing thing, that colonialism isn't over, and that there are still these long-term effects that are being felt by people in our real world. And to an extent, I can kind of cover that using my fantasy equivalents, but it's obviously a lot of people have some very strong and valid feelings about who should be covering these topics and who we should be giving that voice to, and I do support that. I'm an indie author. I know that my books aren't going to be national bestsellers. I don't feel like I'm taking that voice away from anybody, and I will gladly boost that voice whenever I can find it. Ironically, though, I actually wrote a lot of this based on my experience as an Irish person, and the ways in which Irish culture has been erased and assimilated into British. And the fact that there are actually very few people that I talk to day to day who even know about the contributions that Irish people have made to the cultural zeitgeist. Like, most people, surprisingly, don't know that Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, is Irish, and that a lot of the landscapes in that book are based on Ireland. They just associate it with Transylvania and, like, assume that the author was Romanian. Like, so many people I've spoken to assume that Bram Stoker was Romanian. And no, he's Irish. And a lot of books that I see, I've read so many books that just have this casual anti-Irish idea in them. There's a lot of it. Once you're aware of it and you know what to look for, there is still a lot of anti-Irish sentiment. A lot of anti-Celt sentiment that still exists in these culture. And that is actually more what I was kind of speaking to, and then I realized later on, after I got a little more perspective, that it could be easily read as something else. It is actually coming mainly from a place of my experience as an Irish person and the kind of jokes and things that have been thrown my way because of my heritage, even today. And obviously I'm not saying that it's as bad as things that people of color have experienced or continue to experience, but I think that Irish people as a group have a lot more in common if we actually look at our history with those groups, and we should be putting our support behind those groups.
No, that's very well said. And, you know, you bring up some excellent points. Obviously, as Americans, you know, I can look at your books and obviously make a connection to American colonialism, but you bring up a very good point about the colonialism that happened in Ireland as well, and the erasure that happened there.
Colonialism leaves a wide and devastating wake behind it, and
wherever it goes.
I think that we can all stand to extend some empathy to other groups outside of ourselves when talking about those hurts, because I think that we can do more for each other. As I became more aware of how the book might be read and that kind of social commentary, my words may not be perfect, but at the very least, it will be some acknowledgement of that ongoing hurt. It's still affecting the Azures in their everyday lives, even, you know, and for them, it's been like over 1,000 years since the whole ish happened, but they're still feeling it. They're still not equal, and their lives are still inconvenienced every day through big and small means.
Yeah. I'm very glad that you decided to take that approach, because it gives humanity to these problems and makes them very real, and you see the day-to-day effects on what it has on these cultures and how they have to find a way to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I hope it comes across well. All I can do is the best that I can. Whew, heavy.
So going back to the Azures then, we didn't talk about our main focus of book 2.
In Cloudless Rain, it's kind of a minor plot point. It's mentioned, and then we get the payoff of this in Dark Lightning. It is mentioned already in Cloudless Rain that there is a lot of tension between Quoltengera, which exists on the banks of the Quolton River, that is their ancestral land, and this new eastern city called Venez, that is on the other side of the river, that is growing very rapidly. It's becoming like this very big, like, think of like Chicago or Boston, kind of big city. And that already, just it existing there, is disrupting Quoltengera's way of life. It's disrupting their ability to fish and, you know, the general noise of the city, the light, you know, just imagine how disruptive a city is to a natural environment.
Right.
And then imagine that the last stronghold of your culture is right across the river from that. Obviously, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of conflict already happening when the plot of Cloudless Rain kind of comes barging its way in. And it's mentioned that there's this dam project, that the city wants to dam off part of the river so that they can make a better path from the western bank of the river to the city, because they want to have more travel, more commerce, etc. But of course the Azure Village is opposed because that would reroute the river and even further disrupt their way of life. It is technically their land. They are supposed to be the ones who own that river and the rights to it, because there's already this noisy barge that goes across to take people, and they're not fans of that already. And the city isn't either, because it means only a limited number of people can come through at a time. And rather than try to work with the Azures to come up with a solution that actually helps anybody, they basically, illegally, but no one's going to hold them to it, destroy the village. They just come through, they burn it, and the villagers, the Azure people, have to get out and find somewhere new to go.
Oh man, fuck colonialism, am I right?
Yeah, yeah, they could try to hold the people who did this to account. They could try to have their day in court, but no Eastern judge is going to side with them. No Eastern jury is going to side with them. They can't even, deliberately say who did it, because the city can claim that it was just a horrible accident that, and then they immediately start building the next day, but...
Yeah. It's like, well, what's done is done.
Yeah, they can claim ignorance. They can claim that it was just, some anti-Azure group totally independent of them who did, they can claim that. So rather than even attempt to try and have legal justice for what has been done, Keita has to find a way to lead his people to a different life. And so they're being displaced by colonialism, and then they get the main group from Cloudless Rain in, because of course we have to have our main group, and head north, hoping that they can find somewhere that hasn't been disrupted, but then they are the people disrupting, because they're trying to come into a land that someone else owns and try to work out some kind of deal to live there. And I'm going to have another book in the series that deals even more heavily with that, because as of Dark Lightning, their future is still very much up in the air.
Yeah.
As to where they're going to live and how they're going to continue their traditions and their culture in this new environment when they have been completely displaced from their home.
There's no easy answer.
And also the place that they go to, there's already some Eastern influence there that has already been causing problems with the other tribe, Morit Gera, where they try to kind of get some help. They're already feeling the effects because there's this lake, Quilton Lake, which feeds the Quilton River, obviously. One section of the tribe, because Morit Gera is actually so big that it's split into 4 different villages, and one of them, their primary way of life, has also been fishing, and they used to fish from this lake. Well, Easterners have set up a resort on that lake, and so now you have boats and fishing, commercialized fishing, and now their way of life has been disrupted by this colonialism, and so there's already tension there building, and then Quilton Gera shows up trying to find some kind of refuge from their situation, and it's just building and building and building and creating conflicts between the Azure groups where there wouldn't have been before if not for Easterner actions, which is why I say that the real villain of every book is this colonialism, because the conflicts that these characters are having with the other Azures wouldn't be happening if not for the Easterners.
Right.
Every major conflict has its roots back in that.
Well, and I think that it says something very true to how groups of people tend to want to, when problems arise that come from some higher power, like institutional racism, there is a want to go back, or even a need to go back into your own group and say, hey, let's try and fix this problem, even though there's a disconnect between the thing that started it and your group, if that makes sense. It's the community coming together to try and fix a problem that they didn't start.
Yeah, because even if they are able to work out a way that, everyone gets what they can live with, because they're not going to get what they want, obviously. Quilton Gera wants to go back to where they were living, and that's not an option.
Right.
even if they are able to work out something with Morit Gera, the Easterners are still there and still being a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the labor of actually solving that problem has been pushed onto the marginalized group.
Yeah.
I think that's what you were saying, pretty much.
Yep, essentially.
Whew, heavy topics.
Yeah. But anyway.
I have a lot of feelings, and those feelings aren't, too blatantly clear in the book. I hope that it's clear where my stance on colonialism is from the book, but...
Oh yeah, for sure.
I promise it's not this heavy.
Anyway, tell us about, tell us about Morit Gera.
Morit Gera are very fun. I love them. I care all 4 villages, although one of them is causing a little bit of trouble, but again, it's not really their fault because they are dealing with the stress of colonialism. But anyway, I loved gargoyles as a kid. Y'all remember that Disney show Gargoyles?
Oh, yeah.
Here we are. So, it's a clear influence from gargoyles. I love Morit Gera so much. There's 4 distinct villages that make up Morit Gera. They live in this gigantic forest that's just super ancient. Like, they live in the trees. They have built structures in the trees that they live in. And each of the forests is actually divided up by, like, what kind of forest it is. So, in the west part, you have Lumigera, and that's the main village that we see. It's the Sun Village. So each of the 4, there's kind of this motif of 4, the number 4, and also different aspects of the heavens. Mm-hmm. So we have sun, star, moon, and sky that come up pretty frequently throughout this whole series as frequent symbols. So each of the 4 villages in Morit Gera are named after the sun, moon, star, and sky. So here we are in Lumi, which is sun. They're the ones who primarily used to fish in the lake. Mm-hmm. And they live in, like, a big, like, mixed deciduous forest, I would say. The northern side is our moon village, and they live in, like, really thick rainforest, where they don't even have wings because the canopy is so dense that they don't need to fly anymore. Mm-hmm. And over on the east side, we have more the pine forest. That's our star group. And it's a little bit more rocky terrain, a little bit more higher elevation, I would say, because they're kind of getting up into the mountains.
Yeah.
And then the south group, the one that we have not seen and I can't wait to introduce, is our sky group. And they are, like, big. And I don't know what it is about giant people in me, but they're bigger than Colton Gera. They are massive. Because their part of the forest, being the southern part, is the one that Easterners attempted to start logging from, and then very quickly realized that was not going to fly. And there's really nothing that they can do about it because these particular azures are so large and intimidating that they just won't even touch it. Like, they're not out in the open like Colton Gera was. They're in the trees, which makes them even harder to try and dominate. So they kind of just gave up.
Right. But
ironically, Kali Gera, Sky Village, is the peacekeepers, basically. Like, they're the calmest and most rational-minded of all of Morit Gera. Mm-hmm. They would never start a fight unnecessarily. But again, just that intimidation factor works in their favor.
So, in this new tribe that we get to explore in Dark Lightning, we are introduced to probably one of my favorite new characters, Andrea Omari. How did she come to be? I have to ask, just because I love her.
Sweet girl, we stan, we love. Mm-hmm. Andy is so good, and I love her.
Andy, that's so cute.
She has been around since the earliest version. And
go Andy.
Originally, so this is a big part of what changed from the original draft to the current published version, is originally she was part of this group that lived in the mountains and this is where Crimson Lightning comes in. Mm-hmm. So originally there was going to be this group that lived in the mountains that was not quite Eastern, but not quite Azure. Like, they looked more Azure-like, so they just kind of assumed that they were. But their blood was actually red, so that's where Crimson comes from, because That's another, like, physical difference between Easterners and Azures, is that Azure blood is blue, Eastern blood is red. It's a whole thing. Anyway, so we kind of looked at it and we're like, so they're going through this huge forest that has tons of Azures living in it, only to end up in the mountains with this group that is not Azure, that they have no information about. No one's ever heard of this group before. Why?
So real mystery there.
So we ended up just deciding to keep them in the forest. And by we, I mean me and my story editor, who looked at the initial drafts and was like, why are they just leaving all of these Azure people behind that they could get help from? There's no reason for them to just pass through without getting assistance from this group, or at least trying. And I'm like, you know what? Mood. Agreed.
Yeah.
So maybe that mountain group will come back someday. Maybe they won't. But a lot of the characters that we meet in Lumigera were originally part of that mountain group, and then they, you know, through the magic of story editing, ended up being a part of the Azure tribe instead, and their personalities and the personal conflicts that they have didn't change at all. It was just the setting that they were in.
Yeah.
Because they're, you know, we still have all the issues that Andy's family is dealing with, the issues of food being more scarce than they're used to, and trying to figure out how to navigate that, especially with autumn and winter coming, and nothing else really changed, just the setting of where those characters are.
Interesting.
So she was around in the earliest draft to kind of help Azzy into understanding the setting and developing a relationship with him that's outside of his main family, so that he can actually start developing some more social skills, have a little first crush in there that is just adorable.
I love it.
They're so cute. As I know people like to make fun of the love at first sight trope in books, but these are young teenagers who are meeting someone from outside for the first time. Of course, they're going to find them interesting, and they're going to spend time together, and they're just kids.
It feels very natural for kids as sheltered as both of them are.
Yeah, and being like 15-ish.
Yeah.
You know, like, yeah, if it's a 30-year-old who just sees someone for the first time and is like, I'm going to marry that person, like, yeah, I'd be more skeptical. But these are 15-year-olds. They're dramatic. It happens.
They're little babies.
They're just smalls experiencing their first crush.
It's so wholesome. Speaking of wholesomeness, I was actually really surprised by how fierce the bond was between Llewellyn and Azzy in book 2. But it also feels very natural. Was their bond something that you saw right away, or was it something like the characters kind of revealed to you as you wrote?
Azzy and Llewellyn have been ride or die for each other from the earliest drafts.
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes out of the trauma that they share from Cloudless Rain. And specifically Llewellyn not wanting some of the trauma that he's experienced to be repeated in Azzy's life.
Yeah, they've experienced very similar traumas, but come out of it very different people, which is what I find so interesting.
Yeah, and I wouldn't know if I could say that either of them had a worse experience than the other, but I think that their ages and the context that they had of the world before those experiences and then after definitely play a part in their general recovery. Because for Azzy, he knew nothing else, and now is starting to understand the injustice that was done to him, but he has a strong support group. Whereas with Llewellyn, he had what he probably considered an idyllic life that was torn away from him and was something that he was punished for unfairly for most of his life.
Yeah.
And now that he does have a support group, he doesn't know how to connect anymore.
Yeah.
But he can connect with Azzy, and that's something that he protects very fiercely. He is very protective of that bond that he shares with, like, this one person who can understand him in a way that most people just can't. Bros for life.
Yeah. I really love it because, like you said, they have a connection that, like, most people don't understand, and you see that in the writing of the books too, because when Azzy is talking to Eureka or Bolton, there's that disconnect. Whereas, like, Llewellyn and Azzy can more so talk as siblings, as peers, about their experiences. Whereas Eureka just doesn't understand.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with just their age and their development. Mm-hmm. Because they aren't really comfortable talking to adults all the time, given how adults have treated them in the past. Even though Llewellyn is an adult, developmentally he's probably more like a late teenager.
Right.
Physically, I know that he's in his 20s, but when I think about, you know, his maturity level, he's more like a teenager because of the trauma and how that stunted his growth mentally and socially. So they, like, can kind of see eye to eye in a way that it's harder for them to relate to adults about certain things.
They're dealing with shit.
Life dealt them a shit hand, and they're on the same side of the table against the poker dealer. So they connect, they relate, and that has been crucial to both of them in helping them overcome that trauma. Azzy definitely more so than Llewellyn, but his experience has been different, so it's going to take a while more.
Yeah. Have any of the relationships of the characters changed in a way that you weren't expecting while writing?
A little bit. I feel like in earlier drafts, Nyesa was more, like, annoying. Kind of like the know-it-all person who's good at everything and kind of a braggart. Whereas now she's more like the cool big sister.
Yeah.
I think Azzy even refers to her as being almost more like a sister than a cousin. I love her so much. Like, she's definitely got some of that, like, bravado and, like, that big tough energy, but she's also a person who has dealt with some things, is still dealing with some things, and I wouldn't necessarily say she's been humbled by the experience, because she still has that Spitfire energy that I really enjoy about her character. But I think it has given her perspective and ability to relate to Azzy in some ways.
Yeah.
And just like with Llewellyn, how they can kind of talk about some things that maybe they don't feel as comfortable sharing with the adults in their lives, because they know that the adults are just going to take the blame upon their own shoulders and not really help with the situation.
Right.
Which is kind of the big internal conflict of book 2, is the adults blaming themselves for any bad thing that happens, and because they're so busy blaming themselves, they're not actually being useful to that recovery process.
Yep. Absolutely. Speaking of the adults, Bolton and Eureka have had a very complicated but wholesome relationship with each other. And I know that from chatting with you, it's been a hard time deciding how and exactly where they would end up. What do you do when you aren't sure which direction to take a story?
Honestly, I will sometimes, if I have the time, write out both versions and see which one resonates with me more. If I don't have that time, I'll pitch both ideas to my content editor and see which one she likes more. This time, it became a very easy to solve problem because I ship it so hard. And also because I want more representation of asexual people in relationships with the knowledge that their partner isn't ace, but they're going to talk about it, and they're going to figure out how they're going to proceed with that relationship, and it's not impossible for an asexual person to be with someone who is allosexual.
Yeah. I think sometimes you have to write the things that you need.
Yeah.
Right?
Because, like, there's already so little ace representation, and then usually the ace character either doesn't get in a romantic relationship at all, which leads to a lot of conflation between aromantic and asexual, or they're in a relationship with another asexual person so that they don't have to talk about, you know, the boundaries and how they're going to navigate sexual anything with, you know, and it's not something that I'm going to go into detail with because I just don't think that this series and talking about sex are two things that go together.
No, it's a very, like...
But just based on the relationship that Bolton and Eureka have, you can assume those conversations are happening off screen.
Exactly. They have very like, and you still kind of touch on it in the books too. Like, you don't go into anything explicit. It's just a very, like, they're having adult conversations about their feelings and what that means.
Yeah, and you can just kind of assume what's happening. If people want to write fan fictions about what they think those conversations look like, feel free. I can't read them due to as a writer of an ongoing series, I can't read any fan fiction about that series, but if you want to write it, I'd be thrilled to know it exists.
We've kind of touched a little bit on most of the main characters. Do you have a personal favorite from the main cast?
Why would you hurt
Mine's
me?
probably Llewellyn, because I like the broody, edgy boys, but...
I'm sorry. Book
Yeah, I already know that the series is gonna hurt
Book
me.
3 is coming for you specifically.
Oh no.
I do have a favorite character from the series. I couldn't choose between the main four, because Azzy, Bolton, Aereka, and Llewellyn are all characters that are so near and dear to my heart.
Top tier.
But none of them are my favorite characters from the whole series.
Mm-hmm.
Don't make me say it.
Say it. Do
My
it.
absolute favorite character in the whole series is Selkas, who is the villain of the first book. No surprise. I love a villain, and he will be getting his own, like, perspective book, a la Darkstalker at some point. So,
fantastic.
look forward to that, because I'm going to cry.
What author doesn't love the character that puts their other characters through the most trauma? I mean, that's just... Of course.
Yeah, and even though I love him so much and he's my favorite character, what I hope to do with his book is not try to redeem or hand wave away his actions, but just kind of give more context to how he justified it to himself, as opposed to trying to be like, oh, it wasn't that bad, or, oh, see, he had a good reason, because no, he didn't.
He didn't. I love that. I love...
He believed that he had one, but no, he didn't.
I love villains that think they are doing the right thing, even though it's obviously not.
Yeah, and some of the leaps that he made to justify some of his actions, even well before Cloudless Rain, are going to be interesting to cover. But yeah, even post Cloudless Rain, and I hope it hasn't come off as me trying to redeem him in any way, because, you know, he's still kind of, in a sense, a presence in the books, and I've tried to not make it seem like I'm trying to redeem or downplay what actions he took.
No, I didn't read it as that.
Okay, whew.
I like the inclusion of him in book 2.
But yeah, he's my ultimate favorite character from the whole series. I can't choose one from the main four. I love and care for all of them too much.
But not enough to put him through trauma.
I mean, that's part of being loved by an author, is going through the trauma.
Yep.
This is very much a hurt comfort series, which means that there's gotta be some hurt so we can get to the comfort.
Oh yeah. So, just the last few questions. What can you tell us about Stellar Eclipse Book 3?
So, Stellar Eclipse Book 3 is going to be called Echoed Thunder, and that is largely because the conflict that occurs in Echoed Thunder is a direct follow-up to Dark Lightning, so I made their names thematically similar, Lightning Thunder.
Nice. I love that.
And the point of view characters for that book will be Azzy, because Azzy is a perspective character in all of the main series books, and Llewellyn.
Yes!
Will finally have his turn at being a perspective character. As I mentioned earlier, you know, if you've read Dark Lightning, you can already see where that's going. Most of the conflict of Echoed Thunder is going to be internal, so there's not going to be much external conflict happening, because the internal conflict is so heavy, possibly to the point where this might have to go up a rating. I kind of like to use the movie ratings to help audience members gauge what's appropriate and what's not. Most of Stellar Eclipse so far has been PG-13. Echoed Thunder may be kicking up to an R rating.
Ooh, spicy.
Because it's a very heavy internal conflict. It's a very potentially upsetting internal conflict. Like I said, I put content warnings on everything, so please make sure you're paying attention to those. And we will get to see the East, And we will get to see the fourth main Azure tribe, or at least some members from it, Yamakaigera, which is in the south in the tundra, through some means that I can't reveal through spoiler. Well, not a lot, but a sizable portion of that tribe is actually in the east as well. They kind of migrated a bit that way. It'll get into how and why, and we'll get to see some further follow-up from Cloudless Rain and from Dark Lightning as we explore the east. There are a few little puzzle pieces left here and there in Cloudless Rain and Dark Lightning that are, things that may be followed up on in later installments. One of the big ones that was left over from Dark Lightning, we will be looking for Azzy's mom in book 3.
Yeah.
Because we found Dad, but we haven't found Mom. The woman that he was living with in Cloudless Rain was not his mother, was very adamant that she was not his mother.
Right.
So
poor Azzy.
We still don't know anything about the woman who actually gave birth to him, where she's from, what her situation was, how he ended up in the situation he was in, and we are actually going to get those answers in Echoed Thunder. They're going to go find her, and that's part of why they're going to the east, because Azzy is half Eastern, half Azure. Dad is Azure, Mom has to be Eastern, and they are actually going to go track her down using their awesome detective skills that they haven't been able to put to use in a while, and get her side of the story and find out what was up and how this all went down.
Awesome. Well, I'm very much so looking forward to it, especially knowing that, Llewellyn is going to be a POV character. Makes me very happy. And knowing that we're going to explore the eastern half of the continent is really interesting.
Yes.
So then my final question is, what is the best place for people to go find your books and start reading them?
So my books are available pretty much anywhere you can find books online. Like I said earlier, Ingram Spark distributes to Barnes & Noble, Kobo. I don't remember if Apple Books is still a thing, but if you can get books on your Apple products, it should be in their store. Amazon. Did I already mention Amazon?
Maybe. Good to mention
Maybe.
it again.
But if you want to directly support me, the best way to get the books is to go to our Etsy store, which is Roselin Bookstore on Etsy. And we have all of the paperbacks, the digital copies, and also merchandise like character buttons and sticker sheets. So if you want to directly support me, that is the best way to do it because you are buying straight from me. But if you would rather use your Barnes & Noble membership or you have a Kindle, you can also get them at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and any other place that sells books near you.
Yeah. And, of course, remember that indie authors have a time getting their stuff out there. Independent artists are always struggling, so be sure to go support Avalon and her books if these books sound interesting to you. Thank you, Avalon, for joining me. This is going to be a hell of a thing to edit, but I am excited to do it. And I hope everybody has a fantastic week and that you stay inspired.
Thank you so much for having me on.